Greetings, everybody. It's been a pretty hectic session so far this day, and we're going to continue in that vein with discussing why open source is essential for modern business. I'm actually not going to be the moderator. I'm not going to sit up on this because I didn't bring my little orange box with me to get up there. And so I'm going to let our excellent panel introduce themselves, starting with this gentleman here.
Thanks, Shane. So I'm Colin Hart. I'm the head of delivery for Europe for Nearform. Nearform builds bespoke software solutions for our clients, leveraging open source for most of those solutions.
Thank you. I'm Michelle Kearns. I'm head of IT for Boots Ireland, and we're looking kind of Boots as a company, what we can do with open source and how we can kind of introduce it into our culture.
Hi, I'm Clare. I'm the executive director of Finance, the FinTech Open Source Foundation, and part of the Linux Foundation, and I lead the Linux Foundation.
Bill Higgins, I lead AI platform development at IBM and open source at IBM.
Excellent. Well, one thing is very interesting to me, first of all, hearing your introductions, is two of you are involved in areas that would be considered regulatory in finance and healthcare adjacent. So maybe we could get a little bit of an intro of what challenges are there for those kind of industries, starting with yourself, Michelle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just kind of what Conor was saying earlier in the last talk, just about what does it mean for a company, how do you try and sell it? I think definitely for Boots, when you look at what we do, obviously retail is a huge part of our business, pharmacy quite a substantial part of our business. We deliver healthcare services as well. So when it comes to open source, the first thing that everyone always asks is, well, is it secure? If everyone has access to it, like, what does that mean? How can you? So I think one thing that we looked at is kind of culture within the organisation. And because the size of the company, we have Boots Ireland, there's Boots UK, but we're WBA, so Walgreens is our big overlord. And when you're trying to introduce a culture that says, look, this is something that we should do, this is something that we can look at, you have to really look at, not necessarily, it's not about the return on investment that Amanda was speaking about. It's actually, what does it mean? How can we make it better? Why is it making what we want to do better? What are we actually getting out of it that is going to improve for our customers, for our colleagues? And I think just explaining even open source, because I think sometimes people go, oh no, what is this all about? This is just some mad people who sit in a corner on their Linux boxes, which is what we all do as well, but we don't advertise that. But it's just, what will it actually mean for the company? What does it open up? And it's actually the avenues that you need to explore. And as you said, in a regulated industry, especially in healthcare, I mean, there's been a massive movement in the UK in particular, where they had like open source for the NHS. They looked at different platforms that they could choose, but then they did get pushback to go, oh, hang on here now, you can't use that because that's too like Microsoft. It's like, no, it's not, you know. And they had this whole big kind of push-pull with them, because there's a massive open source movement in the UK where they're constantly trying to push in healthcare, but they always come up against that barrier of, well, is it safe, is it secure, what does it do, what does it mean? So we're trying to explain it, change the culture, and get people that simple buy-in in the first instance.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I guess I'm a little bit lucky because I've been running the FinTech Open Source Foundation now for a few years. So I live a little bit in a bubble of financial services and of the actually companies that have already bought into the idea of open source from a strategic standpoint. But I do realize that it's much, the long tail industry is so much larger, and there's so many that are not there yet. What I would say is that when we started, 6-7 years ago, I tried to use the sort of grassroots approach to open source within banks. I grew up in Apache communities, for those who are familiar with it, and it's very, strict in many ways. It's all about the governance. If it doesn't happen in the mailing list, it didn't happen. And I tried to throw that approach at banks. I'm like, wait, do you want me to write to people that I don't know, and maybe the regulators are looking at sort of what my position as Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan is, and that didn't work. So definitely I couldn't agree more that you have to start with the benefit and value attached to it this morning. I think the other area is talent. It's been an area where, especially if you're talking at the right level, would say MD or above, C-level, then you start having a conversation on, okay, yeah, especially in the US, talent wants to work primarily for technology companies. Banks are not as sought after as they were like 10, 20 years ago. So how do you change that? And allowing folks to participate in open source communities, it's good for the company. We talked about the business value, but it's good for their individual profile. And so it makes them way more competitive in the talent market. And it's definitely easier to find talent because you're looking at a pool, much larger pool of an open ecosystem of talent effectively. And I guess lastly, sort of the regulatory angle, it's pretty interesting. Sort of touched on it for us in the finance, especially after 2008, the margins have been shrinking. Both big tech and fintechs have been sort of creating sort of big competition to the banks, and in terms of bottom line, the cost of regulation has gone much higher. So like, there's not like infinite amount of money to throw at the problem as it used to be before, and therefore collaborating in the open. It's not about free, but it's about mutualizing costs. So those are the type of sort of strategic level conversations that then unlock all the how.
Yeah, collaborations are a good traditional way to build trust.
Yeah.
But also you need to build trust from large organizations that believe in open source like IBM does, and through practitioners. So Bill, do you see a lot of persuasion happening, coming from your part of the world, going into these big organizations, and do they come to IBM to build trust or to find out, what they should deploy?
You mean the people who are considering to use open source?
Yeah, especially large organizations that are considering adopting.
Actually, I find these days it's almost the opposite. A lot of customers, if you're not using open source, they're actually skeptical of you because of the, I think, anybody over a certain age has been burned by a vendor lock-in at some point. And that only needs to happen once to leave a mark. And so I actually find it the opposite. I think most people, when they're looking at making investments that have a, either a high risk or a high reward, like a big bet, they'll almost require that there's a strong open source foundation in order to reduce the risk of getting locked in.
It's good to see. And Colin, when you're going in to do a build,
Yep.
are you explicitly there saying, we're going to use open source, or are you sort of going, we're just going to ship this for you? Right? Which way do you push it? Do you try to pull some of that culture in to the organizations too?
We do, and it's changed over time. So, like when I first joined Nearform, back 10 years ago, I guess when Nearform started, it was very much an open source company. It was in their DNA. They did an awful lot of interaction with the community and gained business through that interaction with the community, but they were being brought in those cases by people that also really believed in open source. But as the company grew and started to interact with large organizations, large enterprises, who maybe didn't have any heritage around open source, then yes, when we came in and explained the technology stack for 20 years, you got questions around open source, how safe it is, like all the same concerns have been raised. That's gotten easier over the last few years because I think open source now is much more widely understood. You've got a lot of organizations that are really promoting it. All the big tech companies are heavily invested in open source. So there's a lot less pushback now when you talk to companies about your tech stack. It's standard, it's accepted. There's still concerns in certain organizations around dependencies, the risks, and how you're managing those, how you're mitigating those type of things, right? There's an element of some companies will trust but want the verification, others there's less trust, they just want a lot of reassurance up front that they're not taking any unnecessary risk here. But again, and that's where the maturity of the ecosystem then really helps out. I mean, obviously there's sensible things you do as part of bringing in open source tooling. You look at what's sensible, what's actually supported, what's not, how do you minimize the risk of what you're introducing. And there's lots of good practice around that. It's all well established at this stage. But we don't have to shy away from the fact that the tooling we're using is open source. It's supported and maintained by a lot of different companies, including Nearform. We do a lot of contribution ourselves to open source. But at this stage, I think it's a much easier road, and you don't have to shy away from kind of explaining that you're using open source as part of that solution build.
Yeah. The word you use there, maturity, I think, is well aligned. Things are actually well known and proven. And I guess, you know, what I would ask then, and this is probably for all of you really, is what's the next step of maturity of open source? Usage, adoption, you know, acceleration for business. The maturity level now is that people ask for the stuff, people don't mind it, people understand that there's an advantage to be had. But what's the next higher level win?
I think for us, it's a lot of the innovation you can bring, right? The speed to market when you're building solutions, and you're not reinventing the wheel, right? So in a lot of cases, when for particular companies, we can focus on their specific domain problems, not a lot of the underlying tech that needs to be built to get to the point where you can start building domain solutions. So open source kind of brings a lot of that to the table. So it's really about the innovation, flexibility, and kind of create that customized experience for your clients. But really, what they're focused on now is how do you make it a best-in-class experience for the user. Again, the user doesn't particularly care if it's open source or not, right? They just want a really good experience and good product. And open source is a great way to accelerate getting to that point.
I think that, yeah, that's really important. It's the fact that you want a good product, and a lot of people, like some people, if they're not tech or if they don't have, like, they don't care if it's open what, like they don't care. They're like, does it work? Does it get me where I need to be? And if it does that, then you know, everyone's winning. So I think that's so important. Like, it's how you can show, how you can be intuitive, how you can be innovative, it can be different, but at speed, and then no one asks any questions.
Yeah, what I'd add, and I'm not just saying this because Gab's sitting next to me, although maybe it'll give me a free drink later. So for the things that really matter, like cloud, to IBM, cloud platform, AI platform, things that will make or break the business, where we want to get to is really robust investment and contribution from a diversity of parties, really robust adoption from a diversity of parties. In our experience, that only happens when you reach a kind of an organic critical mass of contribution and adoption, and then finally the project goes under open governance at a place like the Linux Foundation. So for things like Kubernetes, PyTorch, like we really trust that those are going to be fine now because they've hit that critical mass of adoption, contribution, and open governance. And they all kind of go together because you can't really, well, I mean, it's more attractive to put something under open governance after it's got enough of a critical mass. But once it goes under open governance, you see this really big increase of both adoption and contribution. Because, like I said in my talk, a lot of people view that as de-risking, making a bigger bet, either in contributing or adopting or both. You want to add to that?
Yeah, it's actually going to be a bottle of wine. No, obviously I agree. But I would say it's also kind of connecting the two things. The concept of maturity. I think it really depends on the maturity of a certain industry. If we're looking sort of at the world in sort of verticals, and especially as I work more and more in Europe, you know, there's less big tech. There's lots of traditional industries that are all undergoing digital transformation, and I think open source should be like the pillar, like very much cloud or AI now, of how not just CIOs think, but CEOs think about the next level of business. So I think, to your question, I would think an industry like finance, for example, in Finos, great. We've reached, to an extent, it's not hopefully critical mass, 100 members, several anchor projects. So the next level for us is going from just the technology organization to the business and say, okay, this is an industry that is highly locked in, it's highly fragmented. You know, what's the next big thing that we can do together in the open, whether it's an open standard, whether it's a common regulation, to really change the way the industry works. As far as other industries, for example, healthcare is a little bit behind in my mind in terms of the maturity. Maybe it's less tech-centric than finance per se. I think for other industries, it's about still building and getting to this critical mass that Bill was talking about. You know, I think there's a lot that folks can learn from the experience of the Linux Foundation or you know, the first 3 years of Finos were really about building open source readiness, like how you do open source, what are the specific regulatory requirements, how do you sell it to your boss. So we have a lot of material that hopefully other industries can build.
Yeah, and glad you mentioned Europe there, because I might come back to that in a minute to see what's going on,
Yeah.
right? In this multilingual continent of our new continent of ours over here. But just wanted to push on the what you said there, Bill, about the robust investment in contribution and robust investment in, encouraging adoption to get the level of grip to get into open governance, and then the boats come up. How does that happen? How do we sponsor? By we, I don't mean me personally, but governments, businesses, industries, how do they sponsor these things? Or how do they encourage that growth? And Michelle, you're not, so
I'm laughing because I'm glad everyone's here, because right now there's another track going on with Tony Shannon and Gar McChrista, and you have people like that, and you've got Barry Lowry, who was here this morning. I mean, those people are bringing it into reality. They're making things work. They're showing the value, and they've years of experience in doing that. But they're the people that can bring it kind of into the mainstream of, you get in kind of nearly what you put it, like you put in more, we can do more, this is how you contribute. And I think it's just having those people advocating for it is so important. And when you look at like days like today, all of the people that are coming in now, all different industries, it's just even raising the profile. And when you look at the healthcare perspective, the HSE are doing it, the government are doing it. So why wouldn't another company do it? And I think just the more visibility you can get, and the more we can talk about it, the more that you'll get that buy-in in general.
Any other ones on that, Colin? Do you want to?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of sort of iterate what you're saying there, Michelle. I mean, again, with the HSE and the COVID tracker app, for example, and Barry mentioned this morning, before that app went live, the HSE open sourced everything to do with the app. It was the first time they'd ever open sourced anything from a software perspective. That made a huge difference to kind of the trust and buy-in that the app itself got once it was actually launched. OGC are doing the same now with the building blocks that Tony has been talking about. And again, it's like they're doing this in practice in order to encourage others and show how it can be done, how it actually brings benefit. And again, it's bringing it into the mainstream, which really helps them get people to actually understand, cultivate and feed into the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, from my perspective, obviously public sector adoption and contribution and funding, it's been happening, and hopefully it's going to keep growing. I think Ireland is a great example of it, but you're seeing that at the EU level. What I see a little bit less is sort of the multi-stakeholder collaboration within private and public sector, and sort of a little bit of a fragmentation. I know it's a hard problem. Europe is big and fragmented, but my goal, certainly as Dillon's Foundation Europe, is we also as foundations don't have a very clear model of governance for, as Bill was saying, we're doing, I think, quite a good job at marrying individuals and companies working on open source projects. There's no really sort of ready-made structure for the public sector to participate. A couple of our foundations have government advisory council, for example, the Open Wallet Foundation that I mentioned this morning. Clearly is a multi-stakeholder, it touches on digital identity, your vaccine passes, your transactions in finance. So I think if there's something that we can do as foundation is really foster this multi-stakeholder collaboration on open source in a way that reduces that fragmentation, and we can actually work all together, whether it be public sector, private sector, public sector, at different levels, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of it's also difficult to kind of raise the profile of what's actually going on in these particular areas. Bill, just companies like IBM, do they take a very kind of forward communications role in talking to large organizations where they may be deployed to talk about open source, to look at trying to get sponsorship from them, or to inject their own, and for IBM to inject their own kind of sponsorship and funding? Is there a structure around that your system does?
I think we talk to other companies about open source in two ways. The first one is just as part of the sales motion. We always make a big deal out of the fact that our products are based on open source because of the reasons I talked about earlier. But the other thing that we do is that a lot of companies will come to us and say, we would like to embrace open source in our organization, but we're struggling for, name the reason. Would you come and talk to us about how you all leverage open source Again, not to be nice and not to be like hippies about free stuff, but because it's good business. And so we always share those experiences just to help foster open source in other companies.
Great, thanks. I'd like to open up to the floor if anybody has any questions, and I see one down the back here.
Ready for this?
Oh, I look at the time.
You love time.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was interesting. Maybe this question for the panel, but maybe Colin as well. I find, do you find any of your clients are kind of, when you say, I'm going to use open source, that they might go, are you going to open source what you're doing for me as a client? Do you have to like...
Yeah, I mean, that definitely comes up as a question, right, in terms of, because again, often with open source, they will associate, well, everything you build for us is now going to be open source. We don't want that. We're a private company. This is our IP. So there is a reassurance around those side of things, and we're very clear with our clients that it's a very simple message. Anything we build for you, it's your IP. It's not open sourced. It's not exposed. It's completely closed. If you want open source, you can, but I mean, generally they don't. Irish government is a bit of an exception. But we work with a lot of companies where what we build for them is their IP, their proprietary solutions, and it kind of goes back to some of the comments earlier around even how most now proprietary systems are actually over 90% built on open source themselves. So we're kind of adding to that same ecosystem.
Okay. And just another question. Do you ever find when you're doing a project, so say, for a client who wants to keep it private, you might go, say, 20% of this could be open source because it's not specific to your industry, it's very general, it's like a library that does images, for example. Do you ever find you have to convince them, maybe, or do you even bother, to do parts of it open source? Just
generally it won't be, it'll all sit within, kind of, again, within that particular engagement.
Yeah.
It's their IP, right?
Yeah.
You can have a conversation around how you could open source this in order to contribute back to the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And a lot of that will also, often that happens at the grassroots within companies where it'll be developers within those organizations that might be looking at this going, actually we could be doing more here in terms of contributing to open source. So they will often push it internally in terms of we could open source certain pieces here.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah, if I could add to that. So when you design systems with open source in mind, usually what you end up doing is having a platform part that's open source, but then intentionally designing extension points where people can extend it in a proprietary way for value creation for their use case. And this is one of the few areas where things might be a bit easier with AI, because with AI, all of the popular models tend to be trained on 90% of the same publicly available data and then some proprietary data. But then when you go to a company, to make the model really work for them, they have to tune it on proprietary data. And that's actually, with the right tuning techniques, that's actually very easy to segment from the big model. So they can have all of the power of the big model, but tune it with their proprietary data without ever dreaming about contributing that data back to the commons.
Good, one over here.
Kind of broad question for the panel. The idea of outsourcing and open source, are they in conflict? Do they leverage off each other? Do you encounter that at all? Is it a helpful terminology, or is it redundant now?
Well, I would say I go back to the point that they were having before. I mean, they're two different things, I think most folks, when they outsource their work, then they expect sort of the IP to go back in. But when I have large companies, say that the large consultings, working with many banks, one of my conversations with them is like, you're not really making money on the product here, making money off the services, so maybe we can work with your customers to make sure that the work product of what you're doing stays in the open so that we can actually have the other banks work on it. So I think generally, I think the most typical model is that if you are outsourcing work, the IP does not become open source, but I'm seeing increasing examples where actually there is openness, if not maybe like in the public sector, if they're required to open source the output of sort of outsourced work, if that makes sense.
We did a little bit of work actually with a company that we outsourced a lot of our work to, and it was an open source program that we wanted them to work on. But from their perspective, they were kind of like, well, again, like as you said, we're paying them for their services, so they don't really care where it goes. But they thought it was a weird approach because they were like, but what if? And I think it comes back to that whole thing of if you're doing something, are you making it easier for competitors if you open source it? But there is that whole thing for the greater good, and I think especially in healthcare, absolutely in certain industries it's cutthroat and all the rest of it, but particularly in healthcare, if you're doing something, you should kind of be doing it for the greater good. You should be doing it to expose it to other organisations, so that if they're doing something, or if you're doing something and it's working, everyone else can do it too. So I think it depends on the industries as well, where you can actually do that too.
Something else came to mind. Open source sometimes can be an insurance policy, as in if you're outsourcing your work to someone and they're building something for you and then they deliver it back in, and then they run away, who's going to maintain that piece of software? And so I was surprised sometimes working with banks saying, some of the internal teams, they told me, look, I'm not going to build on some other team's component until the project is open source, so that I know that actually if they defund the project internally, there's a chance, and ideally in a foundation, that someone else is going to maintain and have sustainability on that project. So it's not as, I think it's changing, and we have to do a better job to sort of explain the value, but there is a de-risking element, and obviously it's not just about throwing the code out there in the open. They're not going to come unless you nurture it, but it's an interesting evolution. Here we go.
Different type of questions. So obviously there's a huge amount of threat out there. Open source obviously is very vulnerable to that threat, right? Because it's all in the open. We don't necessarily know who's contributing what to what. Like, massive fan of open source, absolutely, but also, the cost of running a project and the security requirements to maintain that, so consumers of those projects, aren't getting infected with things. Just like to hear your opinions and your thoughts of, where that might go, how projects might, does things like that have to create an assessment that's required for every project, or how do we keep it safe in the future?
I have a lot of thoughts. I don't know if you want to jump in. Dillon?
Yeah, I guess the first thing, which may be obvious, is that I think there's this false assumption that the closed software is somehow more secure because you can't see the security vulnerabilities. They're there, you just can't see them. It's like you pick up a rock and a bunch of bugs crawl out, but you might look at the rock and say, oh, there's nothing there. And so, there's a famous saying, who said it? About
Linus.
Okay, yeah. Linus Torvalds. Okay. With enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And so transparency, whether it's in traditional software or AI, is kind of step one towards achieving a more rigorous security posture. And so I think if you understand that, then after that it's just good hard work.
I would say over the last few years, there certainly has been, certain vulnerabilities that came out in open source, like specifically thinking Log4Shell was sort of an awakening moment. And honestly, I was worried. It was like, banks are gonna go back to where we were 10 years ago and just pull back from open source, saying, oh yeah, see, you were right. It's not secure. Instead, they doubled down their investment in the sense that, again, this is not about open source being inherently insecure per se, but there are certainly broad open source sustainability questions around broad open source sustainability. When large projects are well funded and under foundations, there is products built on it, then sort of there is a sustainability flywheel where companies reinvest and the projects are well maintained and well secure, but there are certainly a long tail of projects that need more investment. And so DLF, has been creating, we're not the only one, there's foundations like us that created, we have a project called Alpha Omega, who's basically investing in open source maintenance with grants to maintainers, to companies. In Germany, we have the Sovereign Tech Agency, it's actually a top-level government agency who's allocated money to basically maintain open source in the understanding that it's part of the critical infrastructure, that they're under power plants, they're under banks on it. Actually, I was in Brussels last week. There's now a proposal to level this up at EU level, doing an EU sovereignty agency effectively maintaining open source. That's probably going to cost much less than what we spend for, I don't know, defense or other sort of critical infrastructure. And so it's definitely a conversation and one that I think the whole open source ecosystem is putting a lot of investment in.
I think it's important as well because it's that community spirit as well of that when you have a lot of people working on something, it's that diversity of thought where if you have loads of different people, they will see something that someone else might not have seen or someone else might not have picked up. So it is about fostering that, fostering that community for people to actually want to invest, incentivizing them for them to invest.
Yeah, I think just add one more thing, because I think it's a really important point to understand. So when you think about a big open source vulnerability like Log4j, it's not the fact that it's open source, it's the fact that it's broadly adopted. And guess what? There's broadly adopted proprietary platforms like iOS, like Windows. And so when you see like a iOS 17.4.1 come out and they say, please install this immediately, Apple may have just found that security vulnerability, but it's highly likely other people found it earlier and have been exploiting it. So once again, transparency is step one towards better security posture.
There's some data that showed like that vulnerability got fixed like in a week in the open source, by the open source community. For a proprietary company, you don't really know when they found it and when it's going to be fixed. Two, if you look at even nowadays, there's still about 30–40% of companies that are using the older version of Log4j. So it's not that it hasn't been fixed. The problem is on the adoption side. It's corporates that have not updated that software. So that's not really, whether it's open source or proprietary, it doesn't really change much. It's your responsibility.
Just a question for you, Michelle. Making some of the good work that you've done available to others in your industry. But do you actually have any projects going on with other company organisations in your industry to develop some open source?
We do some. We've actually some with the HSE, and so that we're working on, and it ties in actually with the NHS and the NICE guidelines and some of the work that we did with them over there too. So basically, the condition finders that are available on the HSE. Pretty sure this is not under NDA, but please don't anyone quote me. But it goes back to that whole thing of when we start working with the HSE. I was working with people who believed in open source. So when I brought it to the company, I said one of the conditions that they're going to work with us is that if we open source it, then it will be available to everyone. So anyone can use the APIs that we create out and can use that technology. But I mean, it benefits us as much as it benefits everyone else. So that's one of the things that we're working on. And there are a couple of other projects as well, which,
one more.
Don't worry, Gavin.
I was wondering why you were giggling there. You actually start giggling now.
The evolution's obviously really positive, and some discussions today and all that. But how do we mitigate sort of free rider problems, which is a big one, and make sure we keep this evolution in the right direction? I'd be interested to hear everyone's thoughts on that.
I mean, I think the nature of this is a lot more people consume open source than will necessarily contribute to it. That's kind of true on pretty much everything where even social media, most people read as opposed to posting, right? So that's not going to radically change. But I think again there's an onus on larger companies, governments, organisations to encourage participation in terms of contributions. And a lot of it comes down to that collaborative approach. Like we'd see that a lot, say, with the Irish government and the work they're doing around the digital wallet, digital identity. There's a lot of collaboration going on there between them and other governments, but also them and other tech companies like Google, for example, and the work they're doing in the same space. And all that does kind of lead towards people then being more inclined to contribute and open projects, and that kind of feeds the ecosystem.
And exactly just the project that I was talking about there, that was, when we start working with the HSE and the government, they were like, but are you going to open source it? Because that may determine how we answer your question on whether we'll actually work with you. So for companies like ourselves, like private companies, it'll be really important in the future that if they're one to grow and contribute, that they'll have to understand that they actually have to do something for the market as well. They can't just, as you say, just get everything for free and go, oh, it's all cool.
Well, I mean, I think, I was thinking how technical should I go here, but I think that ultimately it's built in, so there are two very different types of licenses in the open source world. There's a permissive licenses and very restrictive licenses, meaning copyleft licenses. I think if you want to prevent companies from using your software in a, well, I'm oversimplifying here, but if you're using a permissive license, then that is the beauty of open source. Is the IP is going to flow freely, and then it's a game of we need to encourage more companies to actually build strategically on open source rather than just leveraging open source. I think to the point that we made before, you're getting an awareness that if you're largely depending on open source, you're gonna have to invest on maintenance of open source. Otherwise, it's everyone's responsibility. Otherwise, you're gonna rely on the random guy in Nebraska maintaining your library. There's a famous comic out there. I think there's certainly a place for copyleft licenses where this is sort of for social good. That they're completely different ways, but I think people do mix things up, and we're seeing that as a bit of a problem.
All right, well, any more from the audience? We're coming up to time, thank you very much, but I have one question that's going to be for each of the panelists, and it's actually coming back to the title of this very panel, which is why open source is essential for modern businesses, and I'm going to ask you each individually, give me your one-liner on why open source is absolutely essential for modern business. And if you want to, you can tell me what's the best way to start a business to start adopting it or using it, starting with common.
I guess for me, it really allows businesses to have a level of ownership over what they're building, their solutions, what they're putting out there. And open source itself has given them that innovation and flexibility to do those things quickly, to react to the market, and create that sort of best-in-class experience for their customers. So for me, that's really what, the driver behind how essential this is in terms of how they're going to go forward.
What he said.
That is technically a one-liner.
That is a one-liner, but yeah, pretty much. No, it allows you to be part of the community. I'm open sourcing it. It allows you to be part of that community that gets that kind of edge on innovation and gets that kind of and I think it is that diversity of thought around there's so many people contributing, there's so many different minds looking at different problems. You could be out there at the forefront trying to solve things. Yeah.
I would say because Sam Altman said so. Meaning if even the guy who started OpenAI wasn't really open, now he's figuring out that probably is on the wrong side of history of a multi-trillion-dollar industry. I think that's good enough validation for me.
Out of spite.
Yeah, so I just say you can't run a business these days, at least anything beyond a 1 or 2 person business, without software, and you can't do software without open source. The economics just don't work out. If you're trying to build a business and build all of your own software, you're going to go out of business in probably about 3 months, and so the economics require open source.
Excellent, thank you very much, panel. That was great. Just give them a round of applause, everybody.